I'm very, very proud to introduce one of my long-time heroes. When I first went to India, Simon had been and gone doing that job in a previous incarnation of his, and had left behind him one of the most wonderful books that got me set in train several of my subsequent books, called Stones of Empire, a book he did with Jan Morris, and was one of the very first books to look at the architectural legacy of the British in India. Since then, Simon has reinvented himself over and over again. He's one of the most diverse, one of the most inventive, and one of the most adventurous writers of non-fiction. And particularly in his post-journalistic years, has pioneered a new form of non-fiction where he takes some incredibly obscure story that no one has ever heard of before and turns it into a book that shoots straight to the #1 place on bestseller lists around the world. It's a knack many of us would like to learn to envy, and very few do with the same flair. And each time he comes up with something completely different. It's an extraordinary, it's a unique career in non-fiction, and one I've studied with both admiration and, I have to say, envy. Anyway, today I've asked him to speak on what I think is probably the strangest and most wonderful of his books, The Meaning of Everything. I won't even summarize the plot because it'll spoil the punchline and the twist in the tale. But I think it's one of the cleverest works of non-fiction of the last couple of decades, and a book I hugely admire. Originally, we were going to be in conversation. But on my way driving here, I thought much better to just let Simon, you saw what he's like as a storyteller from his non-missionary story, his non-missionary position earlier in the... And so, this is a book I know very well, and I do not need to do homework on it, but I thought much better to let him speak than be interrupted by me. So I'm going to get off the stage, and please give a large round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Simon Winchester.
Well, thank you, Willie. I mean, it was a bit of a surprise. I haven't given this talk for many years now, but I'll do my best. However, I actually think, with great respect, Willie, you're talking about the wrong book. There is a book called The Meaning of Everything, but The Meaning of Everything was spawned by another book, which I will talk about a little, which was called The Professor and the Madman. And The Professor and the Madman is a very strange story, and I'll get to it in a moment. But basically, it is... it's not very confusing. I'd written The Professor and the Madman 20 years ago, in 1998. So that had some success, and then I followed it up with a book about the making of the first geological map in Britain by a fellow called William Smith, which was called The Map That Changed the World. And I was giving a talk about that in Chipping Norton in Oxfordshire. And it was well received, and the book had done very well indeed. But then after it was over, and I had done the signing and so forth, a woman came up to me and said, "Simon, you remember the book, The Professor and the Madman?" And I said, "Yes, I can just about remember it." And she said, "You would agree, would you not, that it was a footnote to history?" And I said, "Yes, sure, it was a footnote, only a footnote." "Well, would you like to write the history to which that was the footnote?" And I said, "What do you mean, the history of the making of the Oxford English Dictionary?" And she said, "Yes, I'm a commissioning editor at Oxford University Press, and I would like to commission you to do that." And so the result of that was this book called The Meaning of Everything, which Willie referred to. But it has some bizarre stories in it, but the main thrust of it is not bizarre, whereas the first one, the Professor and the Madman, was. So what I'm going to do today is briefly describe how the Oxford English Dictionary came into being, and then tell you something about some of these bizarre stories that inhabit the making of the OED. I hope all that doesn't sound too confusing, but if it does, you've got to blame Willie for pitching me into this in the car 2 hours ago. Let me begin by saying that the dictionary is a very modern animal. The word dictionarius comes from the Latin, so it was a list of words, and so effectively, such dictionaries as existed in ancient times. Simply, they were effectively bilingual. It was Latin into French or German into English or whatever. No one had ever thought of writing a book which was a list of words in one language, and let's just talk about English for the sake of argument, and giving them meanings. No one thought about it. I find it incredible today, but people in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, even when Shakespeare was writing, no one thought we should investigate our language. We could say what words mean so that we use the right words. I mean, how did Shakespeare come up with le mot juste, as it were? It's odd, is it not, that we use a French phrase to describe the right word in English. So all he had was a book called The Art of Rhetoric. That was the only book we know that Shakespeare owned and from which he gathered some words. He just assumed the meaning of most and was brilliantly correct in doing so, and then invented a lot of words. I mean, something like 1,500 words came into the language through Shakespeare's plays. But that he wrote those plays without the benefit of a dictionary sort of still further serves to underline the genius of the man, if indeed Shakespeare, of course, was the author of those plays, which there is still some contention about. So the first true dictionary was published in 1604, and I think Shakespeare died shortly thereafter. He never saw it. It was published by a man called Robert Cordray, C-A-R-W-D-R-E-Y, who was a school teacher in the English Midlands. And he suddenly was seized with the idea that the English language needs to be somehow corralled, its words in a sort of alphabetical order, with their meanings. And so he called it, and you can still find copies, or it went into many, many editions in antiquarian bookstores, a table alphabetical. And the subscript is of hard words, mainly for the instruction of women and other unskillful persons. Sorry, this was, don't boo at me, boo at Mr. Cordray. But honestly, it's not my fault, don't blame the messenger. But this was at a time in the early part of the 17th century when, if you remember pictures from illustrations of the time, men wore sort of ruffled periwigs on their hair and knee breeches and very sort of extravagant clothing. Well, similarly, the language was peppered with words that were very long and learned sounding, and they would be used in casual conversation to give the impression that the speaker was learned. Bulbulcitate, I remember, was one of them. It means nothing. Archgrammatian is another. And anyway, Mr. Cordray corralled all these words and got to about 2,500 of them. And it was sort of an aid memoir for people who wanted to be pretentious. They would... you can imagine the fellow in his periwig and his ruff and so forth approaching a comely young maiden at a party and saying, "Madam, will you," and slipping this little book out of his pocket, "would you care to bulbulcitate with me tonight?" So less of a dictionary, more of a vade-mecum, if you like, but nonetheless it was the first amassment of English words in history. And then it triggered a sort of a publishing explosion, and publishers all over the country, and as I say, I'm only going to talk about English here, suddenly started bringing out dictionaries of usually specialists. So there was one entirely devoted to things that fly. So it was wasps and bees and dragonflies, but also birds and things. Anything that had wings was in a dictionary. There was a dictionary of pieces of furniture. There was a dictionary of food. So throughout the latter part of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, a huge number of these books came out, usually small sort of pamphlet-sized books. But all of a sudden, the English language, which had been taken for granted, it was invisible, it was like the air that we breathed. We didn't think about it. We started to think about it. And then one person in particular started to think about it in a very organized manner. And that was the realization of his ambition, was the publication of the first proper dictionary, if you like, of the English language. And that was in 1755, I think that was the year. And that was, of course, Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson set himself up in a workshop just south of Fleet Street. I think it still exists. You can go there. It's a museum. With 5 other men, and settled down to produce a dictionary of the English language. And this, for 150 years, became the go-to dictionary. It was 2 volumes. It was an enormous number. I forget, so this speech was sprung on me, but many, many thousands of words in it. The definitions are peculiar, somewhat eccentric. The one which everyone talks about as sort of indicating the political mood of Samuel Johnson was the definition of oats, O-A-T-S, which is a grain commonly given to horses, but which in Scotland feeds the people. So Samuel Johnson saw himself as a left-leaning man. And many of his definitions are therefore politically slanted or woefully. I wish I had the one of network, but it's unbelievably complicated because it is sort of axiomatic that you don't include in a definition any word which is more complicated than the word you're defining. But I remember Samuel Johnson's definition of the word network, there are 2 words. One is reticulated and the other is decussated, neither of which you would understand. So the definition of network is completely hopeless. So that's 1755, and that, along with the Bible and Shakespeare and the dictionary, that was the library of any moderately learned person in England in the 18th and early into the 19th century. But come the beginning of the 19th century, people started to take a real interest in the language and in the etymology of words, and the fact that we all accept now that the English language, of all the languages in the world, is very much a mongrel tongue. I mean, it draws inspiration from all sorts of languages. It's not pure and seeks not to be pure, and is a rich and wonderful language as a result. And so the Philological Society, the society of people that love words, was set up in London in the middle of the 19th century. And they decided to set themselves a mission of collecting words which had not appeared in Johnson's dictionary. So it was called the Unregistered Words Committee. And they had amassed by 1857, I think it's 1857. The trouble is with being with Willie, 1857 is such an important date because the Indian Mutiny, or the First War of Independence, was fought that year, I think. But I think in dictionary terms, 1857 is a key date as well, because the people that ran the Philological Society of London then realized that they had such a large number of unregistered words, and they had the Johnson's Dictionary and the few other dictionaries that had already come out, and what existed simply wasn't good enough for the language. The language was far outstripping the ability of publishers to, as they saw it anyway, publishers to handle it. So he made a speech on Guy Fawkes Night, 5th of November, 1857, called On Some Deficiencies in Our English Dictionaries. And he made the speech in St. James's Square, the building that is now occupied by the London Library, which, if you don't know, the London Library is, in my view, the finest private library in the world, not to be confused with the British Library, which is a public library. But the London Library is just a wonderful institution. If you go to London, please try and get to see it. Number 2, I think, St. James's Square. Anyway, upstairs, all the grandees of philological Britain gathered there that night to hear this man called Richard Chenevix Trench, who was the Dean of Westminster, a celebrated, very learned divine, and a man fascinated with philology, give his views on how good or ill British dictionaries were. And he came to the view that an effort should be made. And this is Victorian England. And Victorian England was doing grand things, building huge ships, building bridges, having gigantic steam engines. It had a sense of purposeful ambition about it, did Victorian England. And he said, we should create a dictionary which has every word in the English language in it, every sense of every word, every meaning of every word, the etymology of every word. And the way we're going to do it is unique. We're not going to do it like the French and the Italians, who prescribe how their languages should be used. We're not going to insist, as particularly the French do, that words like le weekend and le sandwich are monstrous aberrations and should not be included in the French language. The French language is French and French alone. We are happy to say that our words can come from Saxony or Aztecs or Icelandic, like berserk, or, I don't know, ketchup comes from where? Cantonese, I think it is, or Malay. Anyway, we accept words from everywhere, but we're going to put all of them down in a dictionary. But the way we're going to do it is to illustrate how the meanings of these words have changed over the years, because words are not fixed in their meaning. We're not going to be like the French and fix them. We're going to, rather than prescribe them, we're going to describe them. As a classic example of a word that has changed, sophisticated. To sophisticate something 100 years ago was a bad thing. Merchants, comes from the same root as sophistry, by adding sand to sugar to bulk it out and therefore con the person into paying too much for it. To insert something foreign into something else was to, and usually for not very good purpose, was to sophisticate something. Nowadays, of course, to sophisticate is you've got something extra added to your brain which gives you élan or brio or whatever it is. So the way that sophisticate has changed in 100 years is a small illustration of the way that words change in their meaning. Another example, people in pubs, irritating people. If you use the word to say, I'm disinterested in that, they will jump on you and say, no, you're uninterested. Unless we know, technically speaking, that uninterested means I'm not interested in something, disinterested means you're unbiased. But the fact of the matter is that so many people are using disinterested to mean I'm not interested, that the word's meaning is legitimately evolving, it's changing. And whereas the French would not allow that, the British, the Oxford English Dictionary, will say, well, that is the way the people use it. And this is a people's dictionary. It's a democratic process assembling this dictionary. But, Chenevix's trench, to gather illustrations from history of how these words are changing, how the meaning of these words are sort of slippery and foxy over the years, we will have to read everything in English that has ever been written. And rather like you, everyone said, wait a minute, that's impossible. And Chenevix's trench said it's not impossible, actually. Because what we'll do is we'll amass a gigantic army of volunteers. I mean, you gentlemen, and they were, I regret to say, all gentlemen, are 60 people. But out there are millions, certainly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, not just in England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, but everywhere where the English language has some large number of users. So Canada, United States, South Africa, India, New Zealand. Let's write to them all and ask for volunteers to take part in reading for this dictionary. And what they're reading for is to look for words and in a sentence that illustrates what the word actually means, and then send them to us on slips of paper to our headquarters. Initially, we're going to be in England, and we will alphabetize them and turn it into a dictionary. It'll take a long time. Maybe it'll be 4 volumes, and maybe it'll take 10 years. But we'll start it now. And so they appointed an editor. The first editor was this weakling, incredibly intellectual, very clever man, Coleridge, who was the the nephew of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but he contracted pneumonia, I think, within about, a year of his appointment. He had, however, started properly by creating a set of pigeonholes, which you can see in the Museum of the Dictionary in Oxford, inside Oxford University Press. He thought that a piece of wood or a box of wood with 8 across and 6 down, so 48 pigeonholes, could be used to put the slips in, and that should do it. You should be able to get all of the English language in this thing. It was about that big, not much bigger than this desk. Unimaginably short-sighted was Mr. Coleridge, and indeed it was well filled up by the time he died of pneumonia, allegedly on his deathbed, saying, I must start Sanskrit tomorrow, and then passed away. So his legacy is a very brief one, but he at least started the process, writing to people saying, I want you to volunteer, send your papers in and I'll put them in the pigeonholes and alphabetize them, and then we can derive a dictionary from that. Well, the next editor was, to my mind, should make an incredible subject for a book, called Frederick Furnivall. And Furnivall, very colourful figure, but by this time, the number of slips that were arriving, still in London, where the offices were, was becoming gigantic. I mean, I think by the time Coleridge died, there were maybe 100,000. By the time Furnivall was in full swing, there was something like 2 million, great sacks of slips. And clearly the general public out there was very keen in helping to amass what really was a truly democratic dictionary. I mean, you think of Wikipedia as being a democratic and popularly edited and produced encyclopedia. Well, similarly, the OED required the efforts of everyone in the world that spoke or was fascinated by English. And so their 2 million slips morphed into many more millions than that. Furnivall was an extraordinary, very, very clever man, but he was given to the kind of behavior that, for instance, would not pass muster today. I mean, one of his many, many passions was sculling. He loved women and he loved sex, it must be said. He set up a rowing club in London, and he would pick waitresses up in the ABC tea shop in Hammersmith and urge them to go sculling with him. And you would see these pictures of these young women wearing wet, dripping cold. You can evidently, from the picture, you could tell that they were very cold, having come sculling with him. And you see this sort of wolfish grin on Furnivall's face as he presides over this stable of young women. He had these weird friends as well. Arthur Mundy, I don't know if you've heard of this Victorian poet, Arthur Mundy, who loved women. I hope no one's going to be offended by this, but then this is a fact of history, that he loved really filthy, dirty women. And he liked to take his wife, a very obviously complacent young woman, to crawl up the chimney each night until she was covered with soot, and then bring her down and have a romantic evening with her. So Furnivall, Mundy, filth, lack of organization, because he was incredibly unorganized. It was then by the people that ran the dictionary, still in London, and still not at this moment Oxford University Press, said, well, I think we ought to get another editor. And then, but they turned to another fellow who is the key to this story, really. And Furnivall, nonetheless, remained on the dictionary for the rest of his life, and a huge contributor. If you ever go to the dictionary and look at the word take, which is one of the longest words in the dictionary, occupying many, but 50 or so pages, almost all of it was done by Furnivall. But the man that they turned to in the end, after a great deal of dithering, and was this self-educated son of a Scottish draper called James Murray. And Murray was remarkable, and I should just read you a letter of application that he sent for a job at the British Museum before he was given the job on the dictionary, giving his, as it were, his CV. I have to state that philology, both comparative and special, has been my favourite pursuit during the whole of my life, and that I possess a general acquaintance with the languages and literature of the Aryan and Syro-Arabic classes. Not indeed to say that I'm familiar with all or nearly all of these, but that I possess that general lexical and structural knowledge which makes the intimate knowledge only a matter of a little application. With several, I have a more intimate acquaintance, as with the Romance tongues, Italian, French, Catalan, Spanish, Latin, and to a lesser degree, Portuguese, Vaudois, Provençal, and various dialects. In the Teutonic branch, I'm tolerably familiar with Dutch, having at my place of business correspondence to read in Dutch, German, French, and occasionally other languages, and I speak good Flemish, German, and Danish. In Anglo-Saxon and Muso-Gothic, my studies have been much closer, having prepared some works for publication upon these languages. I know a little of the Celtic, and I'm at present engaged with the Slavonic, having obtained a useful knowledge of Russian. In the Persian, Achaemenian, Cuneiform, and Sanskrit branches, I know don't worry, this won't take much longer, I have, for the purposes of comparative philology, I know these for the purposes of comparative philology, I have sufficient knowledge of Hebrew and Syriac to read at sight the Old Testament and Peshto, and to a lesser degree I know Aramaic, Arabic, Coptic, and Phoenician, although only to the point where it was left by Genesius. But the irony of all that is that he didn't get the job. So, but he did eventually get the job at Oxford. By this time, Oxford had taken the project over and persuaded him to move up to Oxford, which he did, and he moved into a house at number 74 Banbury Road, where he moved with his family, and then deciding that he didn't actually want to go and work at Walton Street in the Oxford University Press offices, he would build a structure in the back garden, and so they quite a decent sized, as most of the houses on Banbury Road in Oxford still are. And I might say that house still exists, and it's owned by Desmond Morris. I don't know if you remember him, the great sort of popular anthropologist. The Naked Ape, I think, was his most famous book. So he built this structure of sort of corrugated iron, basically, which he called the scriptorium being the place where monks used to illuminate manuscripts. And he had his men working for him there in conditions of wouldn't pass muster today. They were incredibly cold in winter. Oxford is very damp anyway. And they would sit labouring over these slips, which by now were sort of 10 million slips had come in. And they would sit with their feet in cardboard boxes with newspaper crushed up in them to keep their feet somewhat warm, or their teeth were chattering. But nonetheless, they all stayed with him, and some of them edited after he had died in 1915. So slowly, under this general prescription of historical principles, because what they were doing for every word was to look for the first time it had ever been used, and then to show how over the subsequent years, with these quotations from people that were sending them in from all over the world, how the words changed over the centuries. And obviously the early words and the oldest words in the English language are things like bread and acre and half and earl. They go back to the 7th and 8th centuries. But then you get the Norman invasion and you get all these French words, which incidentally George Orwell totally despised. And if you look, knowing this, at any Orwell book, you'll see almost all of his words are good old-fashioned Anglo-Saxon words with none of this sort of Latin, French nonsense, as he put it, which makes, once you know that, the reading of Orwell becomes, in my mind anyway, even more pleasurable. So they started putting out the first volumes in the 1880s. A to Ant, I think, was the first one. They came out in fascicles. Fascicles, each one was about 256 pages, I think, and they were sold for, I think, 12 shillings and sixpence to keep the sort of cash flow coming in. And then B and C and D, and it's at this point that I think it's worth mentioning some of these extraordinary contributors. One I like in particular was called Hereward Thimbleby Price. I mean, so many of these people have wonderful names. Hereward Thimbleby Price was a missionary in Madagascar, in a tiny village way up in the north of Madagascar. And he was preaching to Malagasy locals the Bible while his wife was pregnant. And when they were talking about the birth of Jesus, almost exactly the same time, his wife gave birth. And so all the locals assumed that this child was Jesus. This was a practical demonstration of what they were being taught. And they started worshipping him. The missionary said, no, this is not Jesus. I was allegorical. So the worship became so intense that the Reverend Price wrote to the London Missionary Society, who employed him back in London, and said, help, I've got to leave because these people are so keen and they think I'm God. And it's not at all the point. I'm just telling them the word of God. I'm not God himself. So they said, yes, you can come home. And so he came home and moved into a house at 76 Banbury Road, next to where James Murray and his team were producing the dictionary. Now, the thing about Murray is many, many things, but he was a very fecund and fertile man and produced, I think, 11 children. And as soon as they were old enough, they worked for the dictionary. So they all became brilliant at doing crossword puzzles as a result. So these children became friendly with Jesus, as it were, the child. Well, the story gets a bit odd at this point because I think, a little more odd, because I think Mrs. Price then died, or something happened, and Hereward Thimbleby Price in 1912 went over to Berlin to live for a while, I think to get over the loss of his wife, and met a young German woman with whom he fell in love. And they married, and he was, in 1914, impressed into the German army and had to go into battle against his countrymen. And the German High Command recognized that this was a bit unfortunate, so moved him to the Eastern Front to battle against the Russians. And he was captured by the Russians and taken to a prison camp in sort of eastern, southern Russia. But then came the Bolshevik Revolution, and all the guards sort of mutinied and left. And he didn't know what to do, so he traveled eastwards and ended up in what is then was called Peking. And because he was clever and knew the English language very well, he founded and edited the North China Daily News, which was the Peking news. He then went, I'm not sure what happened to his German wife. I think they maybe stayed together. But then he decided he really needed to come back to England. So got on a ship in Beijing, bound initially for Vancouver. And it was foundered in a storm, and the ship sank, and he was rescued and taken to Vancouver, so he survived, and went on the train and got off for some reason in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and the train left without him. And he made his way down to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where there was an extremely good university, and became professor of Shakespearean studies, and died in 1964. So, and he wrote a book called From Bosch to Bolshevik. So that is a measure of the kind of person that James Murray attracted to work for him. Are you approaching me because I'm running out of time? 10 minutes. Well, I better briefly, in that case, describe the most notorious person, which is the person I wrote about in this book, The Professor and the Madman. Every time they finished a volume, a fascicle, and then they were bound into volumes, the people at Oxford would have a party to celebrate. We finished B, or we finished D, F, or whatever. And they would invite all the volunteers who had been the major contributors from all over the country, and indeed all over the world. And the one that they really were keenest of all to invite was a man who lived, because he wrote from the village of Crowthorne in Berkshire, which was only about 30 miles away, a man called William Chester Minor. But he would never come. He would write and say, I'm frightfully sorry. Because he sent in thousands upon thousands of little cards with in tiny, tiny handwriting, with these brilliantly illustrative quotations from books. But he would never come and said, I couldn't get away. So Murray tolerated this because, as I say, a lot of people were very eccentric. And But after about 5 letters, when they were on to something like L, and Minor wouldn't come, even though thousands upon thousands of these quotations were from him. Murray said, well, if Muhammad won't go to the mountain will go to Muhammad. So he got on, if you can imagine the scene. I mean, Murray, a very tall man with a long white swallowtail beard, he drove not a car, but he drove a tricycle round Oxford. So he set off on his tricycle down from Banbury Road, down past the Randolph Hotel and to the Oxford railway station, took the train to Reading, and then went to the town of Crowthorne, where there was in those days a railway station. And because he had signalled his intention ahead of time, there was a landau waiting for him, which clip-clopped off through the lanes of Berkshire and deposited him outside a huge Victorian building, and a servant took him upstairs to an office full of books, and there was a man sitting behind a desk, and Murray made the speech, which he had rehearsed many times, which is a very good afternoon to you, sir. My name is James Murray. I'm the editor of the soon-to-be finished Oxford English Dictionary, and you, sir, at long last are my most assiduous correspondent and helped meet W.C. Minor. And the man on the other side of the desk said, well, it's a great honour to meet you, Mr. Murray, but I regret to say that your assumption is entirely wrong. My name is Dr. Orange, and I'm the superintendent of the Broadmoor Asylum for Criminal Lunatics, which is what this building is. And Dr. Minor is indeed here. But there are 3 things you should know about him. He's a lunatic, he's a murderer, and he's an American. I will take you to him immediately. And I've seen the part in the film, because this has been made into a film at the moment, with Mel Gibson playing Murray and Sean Penn playing Minor, where they meet each other looking almost identical, long white beards, balding heads, and they embrace each other, the one autodidact, Scottish, Presbyterian, high-minded intellectual on the one hand, and an American, Yale-educated, Civil War veteran, paranoid schizophrenic American murderer. Divided by all these things, but nonetheless united by a passionate love for and understanding of the English language. And they became friends for the rest of their days. And a terrible thing happened. If I haven't got 10 minutes, then I've got how many minutes? About 3. Well, I mean, there is a celebrated moment, and I must tell this story. How many? 6. I think I can do it in 6. The people up at Oxford noticed that when they were working on the letter Q, that the contributions from W.C. Minor, who everyone now knew who and where he was, suddenly fell away. And no one quite knew why. And I was in the archives in Broadmoor doing research, and all the papers, 11 linear feet of medical files this man had. It was fascinating to see the history of madness. And most of them in beautiful copperplate handwriting, or later on in typewritten written notes. But there was one note in pencil, hastily scrawled evidently by a guard, which began, Dr. Minor came to the South Gate today, saying, quick, quick, I need a doctor. And the guard said, pray, Dr. Minor, what appears to be the problem? He said, I've just cut off my penis and thrown it in the fire, because he believed that was the root of all his troubles. And that, all of a sudden, I'm reading this, and I would say, well, that would certainly make your eyes water. I could certainly see why you wouldn't wish to contribute any more to the dictionary with great enthusiasm. So I did a lot more research that day, but this is, a wonderful aspect of doing original research. There's a sort of yippee moment. So I went up to Oxford that evening and went into the great room where they're now editing the 3rd edition of the OED, which will be published in 2037. And I said, gentlemen, ladies, I now know and can relate to you why W.C. Minor's work on the letter Q fell off, if that's the word to use, in 1902. And I told them the story. So then I told them the story, and then I said, I'm awfully sorry, I actually have to go because I've got to catch the train down to London. So I went quickly to the station, And as I was buying the ticket, there were two elderly ladies who I knew were lexicographers from the OED, but had not been in the room when I was telling them what had happened. So they said, oh, we're going down to London to the theatre. And I said, have I ever got a story to tell you? So we all got on the train and sat together. And it was an open plan carriage full of sort of businessmen buying motor cars and things. And so I'm telling this story with all the details that I've subsequently found out about how the razor which he had used to cut out the cards, he had sharpened it on the whetstone. And because he was a Yale-educated surgeon, knew how to tie a ligature around the base of his member and then lopped it off. And all the men in the carriage, they all crossed their legs as with expressions of horror. But, and this is the important thing, but these women, elderly ladies, showed no reaction at all, except you could see the sort of lexicographical gears turning in their heads. And they said, and the story is better, and I'm sure it's true if I tell you that they said in unison, autopiotomy. And one of them was called Elizabeth, the other was called Deirdre. And Deirdre said, because piotomy is the amputation of the penis, but autopiotomy is, of course, how you would write it if you did it yourself. And I think, Elizabeth, don't you think I'm right, that this is a neologism, and if it is, then, Mr. Winchester, if you put it in your book in an illustrative sense, it'll be in the 3rd edition of the OED, and your fame will be eternal. There we are. Thank you very much.
Standing ovation. Go on. Up. I think we can firmly say that justifies the decision to ask you to do a lecture today. I have only one question before we throw a couple of questions to the audience. Is there an autopiotomitic scene with Mel Gibson removing his member? And is Sean Penn involved in any way?
The stage direction simply says, noises off.
Do we have time for a quick question?
Yep, 15 minutes.
Do
you want to? We need the mics.
Oh, right.
You can stay there and sit.
I can sit.
Yep.
I love sitting. I'll use yours, Willie. Yeah.
Yellow t-shirt. Wait. Yellow t-shirt. Yes. That's you?
Okay. Who gets to decide what words actually get into the as accepted as English words? Like the word "ain't" really is in like common parlance, but it doesn't work in Scrabble. So who gets to decide? Even if a lot of people use it.
Well, ain't is in the dictionary. It may not be in the Scrabble dictionary, but it's definitely in the OD. And there was a great controversy about its use. I mean, Murray was, and the short answer is it's the editor who decides. Generally speaking, if a word has legitimately appeared 15 times in publications, then it's reckoned to be in the language. But of course, people cheat these days. I had a pathetic attempt some years ago when I wrote a column in a British newspaper to introduce a word which I thought might catch on. It was the word drimmens, D-R-I-M-M-E-N-S, which sounded sort of good and Scottish, and was the word used to describe the trail of grey water you leave on the kitchen floor when you walk in from the snow on a winter's day. And I used it tediously often in the column I wrote. You know, the boy came in trailing Drimmins beside him, but it never made the dictionaries. So you have to work a lot harder than I did. But Murray was very strict about certain things. For instance, initially, he refused to have any adjective based on a country. So Algerian and African, he said, no, you can't possibly. These aren't English words. But then he came to American and realized that, things were legitimately described as American. And so he revised his opinion, and now the dictionary is full of that sort of word. And the spellings, the orthographies were, for a long time, axe was spelt AX in the OED and not elsewhere. Interesting, there are many things I could go on about. What do you think is the word that occupies most column inches in the dictionary? It used to be the word set, S-E-T, but it's now the word run. At least those are the two verbs that occupy the most. The noun that occupies the most, which I think is 80 pages, is see, S-E-A. So those little words have got many, many meanings and senses to them. And the difference between a sense and a meaning is something which, if you do get the meaning of everything, which explains not just the W.C. Minor story, but the whole story of the making of the OED, that sort of explains it. And I urge you to look at the fake entry for the word radium, R-A-D-I-U-M, which Murray thought would never last. He thought, this is just something that will just a fancy. And so they teased him, and one of his sub-editors wrote a fake entry, which mercifully nearly made it into the dictionary, but mercifully did not. They only lost one word, and that was the word bondmaid, B-O-N-D-M-A-I-D, which the slips fell behind an encyclopedia, and it wasn't discovered until the 1930s. But the dictionary is 90 years old this last month, the 28th of August, 1928 was when it was born. The second edition came out in 1989, and in a 20-volume iteration. And the third edition, which I mentioned, comes out in 2037, they think, will have 40 volumes, if indeed it is published in hard copy, which I think it will be, and will have just about 1 million words. But we're not the slowest dictionary. The Dutch National Dictionary, no, the Swedish one has been underway since 1898 and is still not finished. They're stuck on the letter S. And there are other dictionaries. So lexicography, if any of you don't here have a job, repair yourself to Oxford or Stockholm, or indeed Chicago, where they're trying desperately to finish the Chaldean dictionary, which has been in progress since 1902. Chaldean, yeah. That's an interesting question. There are about 4,000 new words entered into the English language every year. Now, a very large number. They gain currency very swiftly, but equally pass their sell-by date very quickly. And the OED editors are very alive to this, and so are cautious about introducing words that seem to have a sort of mayfly-like existence. So they've somewhat revised their view of it has to be in 15 publications before it's taken seriously. To explain, there's no algorithm, believe you me, and I'm delighted to say that algorithms do not. It's a personal decision based on the readings of very, very sensible people. And the official history of the OED, produced by a man called Peter Gilliver, came out this year. It's very much an academic book. So if you want a sort of child's guide to the making, which answers questions like that, mine. If you want a grown-up version, Peter Gilliver's. They're the two books. I'd prefer you to buy. Mine is cheaper too. What about what? Well, yes, some of them, felching is not in it, but the C word is in it. Oh God, the F word is in it, yes. It's a word of great antiquity and beauty. What? Anglo-Saxon. The C word, there was a grope, something laying in London in 1320. So Trump was not the first to talk about groping such things. They did it 600 years ago. But for the really dirty words, you want Jonathan Greene's Dictionary of Slang, 3 volumes, produced about 5 years ago, and that's got all the really seriously bad words in it.
Over here?
Yes, sir.
I just want to use as an example and see the response to the way people are now using the word woke, W-O-K-E. That might be a really good example of what you're illustrating, whether it's passing its sell-by date, would it get adopted, has it been adopted in the way it's being now used on social media?
I think you're absolutely right to question it. I can't give an answer. I would suspect it probably won't last, and probably therefore won't be in the 3rd edition. But who knows? I mean, it's up to...
How long do they have to be around, or how quickly do they have to move out of usage to disqualify themselves, for instance? Or is that an intuitive call
I think
by the editors?
that's a very good question. I think it is an intuitive call. The OED is not produced by old white men. I mean, it used to be, and it is a monument, if you like, to Victorian and imperial English. But it's a very inclusive bunch who are in the OED offices now, and the volunteers, the people that submit words, because everything goes on just the same. And anyone here is welcome. Go to the OED website. You can become part of it. If you see in your readings of a journal or a magazine or a book, a word which, even ordinary words, which you think is in a context which illustrates a meaning or a sense which you weren't fully aware of, quote it with a citation, send it electronically now to the editors at the OED, and you'll be part of the great usefulness which a democratic dictionary demands of the people that use it. So, but woke, I don't know specifically, but I think going back to your question, it's intuitive.
Splendid. I just want to say, to quote your book, The Man Who Loved China, any biography, and I hope there will be many of yourself, will say, the man who loved words and spread the word.
But explain, just for the audience that may not know, which includes Willie, woke. What do you understand the meaning of woke to mean?
It means people that are hip in an almost political and cultural way. It was just used the other day, even in connection with the Kavanaugh hearings, that people are woke, that are woke, know such and such.
Yes.
So it's sort of a more elegant word for hip.
It's a hipper way of saying hip.
It's a hipper word than hip.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah, more elite.
Yeah. The word, I guess we've all got our favorite words. One I like, and indeed it comes from a different dictionary, is the word eclair, which, as you know, is a chocolate cake. But and of course, the eclair comes from the French word lightning. That's the speed at which you eat it.
Yep.
But it says, but the definition in Chambers' 20th Century Dictionary, which is a cake long in dimension but short in duration.
Splendid.
Can I just say one final thing? My absolute favorite word, which shows the brilliance of the English language, is the word malmarocking. It's spelled M-A-L-L-E M-A-R-O-K-I-N-G, malmarocking. And that also was first, it's in the OED now, but it was also in Chambers' 20th Century Dictionary in an edition published in the 1940s. And the definition in the 1940s of malmarocking was the carousing of drunken seamen on icebound Greenland whaling ships. But a new edition of Chambers' 20th Century Dictionary came out in 1974, and malmarocking was still there, but its definition had been subtly changed. It was malmarocking, the carousing of drunken seamen on icebound whaling ships. The word Greenland had been omitted, which led an editor at The Guardian to write a tongue-in-cheek editorial saying the monstrous practice of malmarocking appears to have become unleashed from its native Greenland, now is in danger of spreading across the world. It must be stopped.
I think we should call it a day on that note. One last big clap, please, for Simon Winchester.